Hello, and thank you for joining me for this session, Using Data to Support Social and Emotional Health, Well-Being, and Learning. My name is Jessie Newman. I'm a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research, better known as AIR. Our mission is to generate and use rigorous evidence that contributes to a better, more equitable world. We do work in research, evaluation, policy, practice, and systems change, and we do this work across a number of topics. Our work in youth development and supportive learning environments includes after-school and expanded learning, social and emotional learning, and family engagement in both in-school and out-of-school settings. Through funding from the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, AIR is an active member of the After-School Technical Assistance Collaborative, otherwise known as ATAC. We support the 50-state after-school network. We provide support for the networks through resource development, providing content expertise and training, speaking engagements like this one, and technical support. So I'm based in Chicago, but I've spent the better part of the last decade working with cities, states, national youth serving organizations, funders, and intermediaries across the country as they work to identify the best ways to support young people and adults in their social and emotional development journey. So I'm really excited to have you here for this virtual session today. But I will say, as we've all gone virtual these past few months, I have no doubt that you are adept at engaging in meetings online. But I did want to just share a few things about the design of this session in particular. So first, please note that you can enjoy this session on your own or in small groups, as is safe, of course, and I'll give options for both as we go. So this session is designed to be flexible, right? Take the time you need or take the time that you have. It can be done in 30 minutes or you can take longer. Now, there will be times where we stop and think or engage in reflection, and that's where the time variation comes in. So if you're on your own, take a few minutes or take an hour, right? It's up to you, whatever time you need to think through the questions or work with the tools that I'll be sharing. Now, if you're in a group, I'll try to offer some guidance about how to engage in some groupthink, and I'll note approximately how much time you might want to set aside. I'll be sharing tools throughout the course of this session, and you'll have access to everything. If you're able, make sure that you have them readily available now. It'll be a really good reference for you as we go. You'll also need paper and a pen or pencil, or maybe another screen if writing by hand isn't your thing, but make sure that you have all those materials now. You can go ahead and pause this session if you need to. Okay, so let's get started with the grounding exercise. This session is all about two of my favorite things, social and emotional learning and data. So I want to just kick us off with a very simple question. How are you feeling? I want everyone to just take a minute, notice how pleasant you feel, notice how much energy you have. This is a mood meter, so it has two axes, right? The x-axis is pleasantness. This is your subjective, private experience, where -5 is the most unpleasant you've ever felt, 0 is neutral, +5 is the most pleasant you've ever felt. And then the y-axis is energy, right? How much physical energy is running through your body, the same kind of rating scale. So take a minute or more if you want to hit pause and reflect on how you feel, and then pick the color that best describes your current state. And you can exist anywhere within the quadrant of that color. There are no right or wrong answers. There's no judgment. There's no quality to how we feel. It's just information. Yes, I'll say it. It's data for us to consider and use, right? Our feelings are valid. They're okay. If you're with a group, you might want to pause this recording, and if you want, take a minute and share how you're feeling. So I'm a big fan of using a mood meter or something like it, not because it's a nice way to connect at the start of the meeting, although it is, but also because our emotions are so directly connected to how we learn. So it's really helpful to start by understanding how we feel and where we are so that we can process and learn better, right? So your self-awareness is really important, but it also helps me as the educator here right now to see how all of you are feeling. So if we were together, I would use this data to help me gauge my pace, how I share information, right? I might observe, if we were doing this virtually, who wrote in the chat, or maybe who didn't want to respond at all. And I might ask you to consider a few other questions like, what would help you in this moment to maybe manage your emotions or to be more present, come to the table ready to learn or participate more fully. So I start this exercise for a few reasons. One, so that you can check in and get grounded for this session. 2, to share a strategy with you that you can use with folks, right? 3, to introduce this concept that there is a connection between our feelings and our emotions and our ability to engage and learn. And then finally, the 4th is to demonstrate that data is everywhere and is awesome. So during today's session, we're going to talk about data. We're going to talk about what it is, how you can identify data sources and use it to support young people and adults, and things that you should consider when selecting maybe a more formal tool or engaging in a data collection process. We'll also talk about what you can do next as soon as you finish this session, right? So we're really aiming to be practical and actionable here. My goals for you are that you finish this session with what I'd like to call a data-happy mindset, and that you learn to see data everywhere, right? That you feel really good about gathering it, using it to drive practice, right? That means using data effectively and in ways that work for you and your staff right away in the real world. So at this point, you might be like, wait, is this the right session? I thought this was all social and emotional. She's going on about data. What happened? But this is the other side of the session, right? So we're talking about data, specifically data or information that you can use to support the social and emotional side of things. So we're going to tie the two together as we go. And we're also going to do this in the context of the pandemic and the social discourse that we're experiencing across the country, right? Because this is context. This is something we're all experiencing in many different ways, and we need to understand that and acknowledge it and work to support each other. And our social emotional needs are so great right now. So using data is a really good way to make sure that we're providing the support that folks need and that we're doing so in an aligned and intentional way. So as we think about social and emotional learning and coming back together and really supporting each other, I want to offer everyone 3 big buckets to think about. First, it's our health and well-being. And if you've never thought about this social and emotional learning or SEL stuff, or if you've been in the SEL game for decades, I really encourage everyone to start here as we think about supporting each other, both young people and adults alike. It's asking a simple question like, how are you doing? And then responding accordingly, right? That is data gathering and data use. The second bucket is conditions for learning. It's making sure that people feel safe and supported so that they can learn. And then the third bucket is the actual process of developing social and emotional skills, what we refer to as SEL, right? And SEL is defined by many as a process of developing social and emotional skills, right? It is learning. It's an active verb. But the key thing to remember here is that we can't engage effectively in the learning process if we haven't gone through those first 2 steps, right? So thinking back to that mood meter exercise, for example. Now, there's a whole body of research and evidence. Maybe you've heard the science of learning and development thrown around. I'm not going to go into that in this session, but I am making some resources available if you want to learn more. What I think has been really powerful to observe right now is that we're seeing a really strong emphasis on social and emotional health, well-being, and learning in a lot of the reopening frameworks, the guidance that's coming out. So this topic and meeting young people and adults and the whole child and all of their needs, it's going to be even more important going forward. So now that I've set the stage a little bit, I want us to reflect a little bit on how we feel about data. I'm going to ask you a few questions that you can respond to using the answer choices on the screen. If you're on your own, sit, take some time and think about your response to the question. You can pause it if you need to. If you're in a group, hit pause after each question and sit and talk about your answers together, right? Maybe take like 1 minute to think about your response and then 30 seconds for each person to share. If there are a few of you in a group, maybe turn and talk in pairs instead, right? Remember, you can always pause this if you need more time. So let's start by rating your love for data. Here are your answer choices. How do you feel about your love for data? No thanks, love-hate relationship, or that you love data? Okay, move on to the next one. Rate how regularly you gather data. Never, like sometimes, or every day? And I'm going to tell you, this is kind of a trick question because the way our brains work, we're always gathering data. So everyone should answer every day. But what I mean here when I ask this question is, how often are you intentionally gathering data in the context of your program? Next question, rate your level of comfort with data use. Not at all, if I have to, or consistently because data is amazing. And I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek here. Obviously, you all know my biases. Okay. So just like the mood meter, if we were together, I'd be using data to drive how I run the session, right? Your level of comfort, your level of enthusiasm. This is all super important for me to know. And yes, I was a little tongue-in-cheek, right? I made some silly rating scales. But if we were together, I could have also just asked you the question, right? Like, how comfortable are you with using data? That is the discussion, and I'm learning, right? So if you're with others, hopefully you were able to have some discussions so you can get a sense of how people feel, where there are similarities, maybe some differences, right? And if you're on your own, it's also really good to reflect on how you feel as you engage in this session. So here's the thing that I don't know that everyone realizes when it comes to data, and that's that data exists in many different forms, right? You might think about it like a bar graph or a pie chart. Maybe you think about it like an observer who's like watching you do your programming, but it's also conversation, it's connection, it's more formal things like youth surveys or community meetings and town halls, right? Just to name a few. So there's a lot of opportunity here to reframe how we think about data and learn to recognize it in a lot of different forms. The other important thing to remember here is that there's a range from formative data that's used in an ongoing way to summative data that's collected only at strategic time points, like maybe at the end of the program, to answer a very specific question. There's a lot of decisions we make around that. So some of the methods that I've described, and that I'll continue to describe, are going to be more formal, and some are less. Ultimately, your reasons for collecting data will drive your decisions around what data to collect and how to use it. But I think one of the goals here is that you really do have a mix. So one of the resources I'm sharing with everyone today is called Ready to Assess, and it's a suite of tools that's designed with the express purpose of helping educators make good decisions about assessments related to social and emotional learning. We released a new edition of the tool last year, and in that new release, we included this logic model that you see on your screen, and our goal was really to expand thinking around SEL-related data. I think most people probably think about outcomes, right? We're doing this SEL thing, that's the process of learning new skills. So did young people develop the skills that we hoped they would? But if you think back to that 3-step process I showed you earlier, it's also really important, I would actually argue more so, to take a step back and measure whether and how we're creating those optimal conditions for learning. It's only once you have those things in place that you can effectively support social and emotional learning. And so this is where maybe more formal measurement tool can become super handy. Program quality observations, for example, fall in this bucket. This is something we're really familiar with in after school. So when you're choosing any kind of assessment, whether it's conditions or outcomes or anything else, there are a number of important considerations, right? Your purpose is the first one. Why are you doing this? What do you want to learn? What are you using the data for? So we've identified 3 primary purposes that most people use an assessment for, and that's information, communication, or accountability. And sometimes you can have more than one purpose for the same kind of data. More information on each of these is found in the Ready to Assess brief and the decision tree that I've shared as part of this session, so definitely go take a look. You're going to hear me come back to purpose a lot. Really, everything starts there. So once you know your purpose, then you use your purpose to align the rigor of the instrument, right? Really think through the practicality and the burden. So I'll give you an example. If your ultimate goal is to understand how kids are feeling this fall, right? Check in on their health and their well-being. You want to use that information to drive your programming, then like a 72-item multiple choice assessment for each kid about their social and emotional skills might not be the best way to do that, right? Those kinds of assessments are super high rigor, and that's a good thing, but they're also kind of impractical for your purpose. They're really expensive, they're time consuming. That's a lot of data to interpret and make meaning from, right? So in this case, bearing in mind that specific purpose, you could maybe just develop a short survey with a few items or set up one-on-one mini conferences, let's say, between staff and youth, right? It's a different kind of rigor. It's also much more practical and less burdensome. Plus, if you do it right, then you're supporting relationship building, which is always a good thing. The other big thing to consider beyond purpose, beyond rigor, practicality, burden, is ethics. And this is a big one, right? So the ethics questions really are intended to align with the steps that I just named, right? Rigor, practicality, burden. But ethics considerations really also help you think through things like how you're going to use the data and if you're using it in the way that it was intended, or if you're administering a tool with the populations with whom it's been tested, right? So this is really important all the time, but especially if you're using a more formal tool that's out there. If you do currently use formal assessment tools or a set of tools, I'd recommend that you pause this session right now and really think through some of the questions that you see in front of you. They're also found in the Ready to Assess brief, so if you want to meet as a group or think through them later, that's an option too. Okay, so let's connect some dots here. We're going to use the 3 steps I shared earlier, and we're going to line those up against the considerations I just named, like purpose, rigor, practicality, ethics, right? So we're going to identify some tools that would help us gather and use data to support social and emotional health, well-being, and learning in light of everything I just shared. So let's start with this first bucket, this health and well-being bucket, right? The how are you doing question. I'm going to assume that your purpose here is likely to gather information. This is really more formative inquiry. It's one that I think we'll pursue on the regular, right? Now, sometimes we ask people every day, how are you? I think about that all the time. I start most of my calls or meetings with how's everyone doing? And there's a response, and then we just move on. And I don't know how often we really stop and open it up for honest dialogue and truly listen to how the other person or people are doing so that we can respond accordingly. But that's the level of intentionality and data gathering that I'm talking about here, right? And we can always stand to be more purposeful. Now, the mood meter that I used earlier is another great tool, right? And I'm sure most of you, if you run program or you support staff who run program, there are strategic, circle time activities or icebreakers that you use at the start of an activity, for example. And those are great. They're great for people getting to know each other, but they can also be good for staff to use for data gathering so that we know how people are doing. Now, if your purpose is raise the stakes a little bit, let's say it's for communication. You've been asked to find out how your kids are doing and what their, let's just say their pandemic experience has been, what their needs are right now, so that you can share that information more broadly, right? Communicate it back to someone who's making decisions, then the stakes are a little higher. So maybe something like a survey is a good idea, or interviews or focus groups, right? Again, the purpose doesn't necessarily warrant some intensive formalized assessment, but something a bit more rigorous and reliable could be appropriate here. So the next step in this 3-step process is ensuring that you're creating positive conditions for learning. Now, this one gets tricky with the current context because safety is foundational to conditions for learning, right? Especially physical safety. And we're still trying to figure out what that means right now. So not that I want to ignore the pandemic, but I am just going to set that can of worms to the side for a minute so that we can focus on some of the other aspects of conditions for learning that are relevant, no matter what. With conditions for learning, it's going to be really important to think about the different learning environments, right? There's a physical building potentially, a virtual learning space maybe, and there's also the home. And so people really do need to feel safe, both physically and emotionally safe in order to learn. But the emotional safety piece is really going to be a big one. It means finding ways to make space for people's feelings, right? Or building in structures to support that. And on the same side, feeling supported is going to be really critical, right? A lot of the guidance we're seeing coming out is around how to create safe and supportive learning environments for young people. But we can't forget the adults. They won't succeed in their efforts to support young people if they themselves don't feel like they have the support they need. So again, let's come back to purpose. If your goal is information gathering, I'd say start by talking with your staff. Understand their experience, learn more about what they need, and then respond accordingly. That not only gives them what they need, and you're giving them what they need because you gathered the data about what they need, but it also serves to build trust and connection in your broader community. And that also then helps your staff do that with young people. There are also a number of formal tools that focus broadly on conditions for learning, or a lot of times what we refer to in after school as quality. All right, so here's one example. This is an SEL practice self-reflection tool that we're making available to everyone. If you have it accessible, feel free to grab it now. This tool is evidence-based. It's grounded in effective practice, but it's designed as a self-reflection, right? So it's better aligned with formative use, really designed to drive improvement. The stakes are lower here, right? It isn't meant for accountability or compliance. If you get this, please don't use it that way. But because of that, there's a lot of different ways that you can use it. The tool has 3 sections where staff reflect on their practice. They give themselves a rating, right, add up a score, and then they use that data to create an action plan. So it's simple and effective from what we've heard from folks in the field who are using it. Now, another resource, especially if you want something more formal, right, a more rigorous tool, maybe something that's reliable and validated and has all those good psychometric properties because the testing has been done, you can find them in the Ready to Assess Tools Index. This Tools Index is broken up into 2 sections. The first one is conditions for learning, and that includes things like quality, climate measures. The second section is social and emotional competence, which I'll get to in a minute. And then within those 2 big sections, there are subsections by grades. So there's a section for early childhood, elementary, middle and high school, and then workforce. And the cool thing about the Tools Index is that you can find measures based on what it is that you're aiming to measure and how. There's information about what each tool measures specifically, who the respondent is. So like, is it something you do yourself? Do families complete it? Young people, for example. It has the number of items, the cost, and the setting. So you could go in and find the ones that can be used in out of school time setting, like an after school program, just, as an example. The thing about a lot of these measures is that they can be flexible or not. It really is up to the developer. So I'll use the program quality assessment, or the PQA, as an example. I think that's something most of us are familiar with. The PQA can be implemented formatively, right? It can be done as a self-assessment, or it can be, with higher stakes, right? People like researchers like me, for example, can get trained as an external assessor, and come in where the stakes are higher and the data use is different, right? I use the PQA a lot in my research studies, where we come in to do an evaluation, or a funder wants to know whether their investment in program quality is panning out, for example. So again, it's just really important as you think about data gathering to really understand your purpose, your practicalities, how you'll use the data, but really make sure that when you're using a tool like this, you're using it in the way that it was intended, right? And all of this really should drive what you measure and how you use it. Now, the same thing goes for measuring social and emotional learning outcomes, right? Like whether young people are developing the competencies that you hope your SEL practice supports. I could probably spend hours on this topic, so I'm just going to skim the surface today. But there's one really, really big important point that I want to make here, which is that you see the steps, right? There's a reason that SEL is at the top, that it's the 3rd step. You have to go through the other 2 to get there, right? We absolutely have to make sure that people are healthy and well, and that we've created conditions that support their learning. All of things that we can measure, as you've seen, before we really start thinking about looking for outcomes. And I know I'm emphasizing this. I feel very strongly about this, but this is where our original idea of, are you ready to assess actually came from, right? It's really thinking through, like, do you have the right things in place to even expect this, and to focus on young people before you focused on the settings and the conditions where the young people are. So let's just skip ahead for a second. You're ready to measure the competencies. Cool. As I keep repeating, purpose, rigor, burden, practicality, ethics, you've considered all of that. Now you're ready to select a tool. The second half of the Ready to Assess Tools Index has a huge list. And you can see, again, just like the last section, there's a list of what it measures and how, what settings it can be used in. And again, you might not need this level of formality and rigor, right? There are ways to see how young people are doing in the moment, right? What we've all heard Dale Blythe and others refer to as taught and caught, because research suggests that people learn best, they develop skills when they have the opportunity to demonstrate those skills in the real world and get feedback in the moment. So like I said earlier, a mix of both, maybe a more formal tool at certain key points in your program year, but also gathering data in the moment to see how young people and adults are developing these skills and where we can improve or adapt. And so here's my last word of caution on this. I think we all suffer from what some people call the jingle, jangle, jumble in our field, right? Where we use the same words to mean different things and then use different words to mean the same things. It's kind of a mess. So Stephanie Jones and her team at Harvard have been working really hard to create this cool new tool that will help with that. So it's called Explore SEL, and it's designed as a navigator for the field. And on this website, they provide information and tools that summarize and connect the major frameworks and skills in the field. It's really designed to support transparency and informed decision making. So there's, for example, like a framework navigator where you can go in and click the different competencies that you want to focus on, and it'll show you what frameworks it shows up in, for example. And there's ways to look at, I'm calling it self-management and you're calling it behavior management, or, someone else is talking about emotion regulation and how are they all connected. So this is a really useful tool for breaking that down and helping people sort of make sense from all the different terms and frameworks that are out there. So you have all of these considerations. You know about all these tools that you can use, but where do you go from here? My recommendation to folks is always start where you are. And hopefully where you are has a paper and pen or a pencil so you can do some work. So if not, pause now, go grab something, open another screen on a computer or tablet. But we're going to spend some time thinking through the data that we gather and how we use it. So you can see a simple table with like a worksheet kind of set up in front of you. And I think this is a really easy way to answer some of those questions I just posed, right? Start at the top. What is it that you want to know? What is your question? I think a lot of times we make the mistake of starting with the data that we have rather than what it is that we want or need to know. But if you start with your question, your area of focus, this really helps to understand purpose, which if you take one thing away from here today is that purpose should drive everything. And then once you have your question, your purpose, you can start by listing out the data source, the tool, right? How you go and gather that data, who gathers it, the when, the how, where that data lives. Like, is it just in someone's head? Did they take notes and write it down? Is it a survey? Was it Excel or something like SurveyMonkey? And then how you use it. And here's the other thing. If you can't fill in that how you use it part, then you need to stop there and figure that out. Ask yourself either like, one, why are we gathering data we don't use and do we need this data? Or two, why are we working so hard to gather data that we aren't using? So what can we do to make use of this stuff, right? So feel free to hit pause now and spend some time working through these questions. You can recreate this table for yourself or put it on a whiteboard, whatever works for you. You might have multiple rows for the same data source, right? Something you collect multiple ways with different tools. You might have 10 of these tables because you just have a lot of questions. So go ahead, hit pause now, spend some time, depending on whether you're by yourself or in a group, 5 to 10 minutes, talking through some of this. You don't have to get all the way through it now, but at least get a start. Now, there's something else to consider, which is whether there are questions that you have that you can't exactly answer yet, right? You can use the table for that purpose too. What do we want to know? Maybe it's one of those steps I shared earlier, like how young people are doing as they return back to school. And then use that to think about, okay, well, what information do we need to gather to answer our questions, and what is the best tool to do that? On the other hand, you can actually think about data that you gather that maybe isn't tied to a question that you've asked and try to use the table to explore that, right? The key here is being really intentional. Data is a powerful tool if we're aligned and intentional about what we gather and how we use it. Otherwise, it just becomes a burden and we're doing all this work and we're not really making any meaning from it. So just to recap, the first thing to take away from today is that data is your friend. I hope you leave this session with a new approach to data and what it can do to help you make decisions and enhance programming. The second thing is that intentionality and purpose are key. If we're going to do this, let's have a question, a reason, and think through the practicalities, the burden, and the ethics so that we can make smart choices. Data gathering and aligned measurement supports practice, right? And there are tools to do that. And there are tools to help you pick the tools to do that. So make use of them. We'll make everything available after the session. And finally, as you think about data gathering and engage in program planning, start with health and well-being, then move to conditions for learning, and then focus on competence development. Thank you so much for joining this session. Please be in touch if you have any questions, and good luck.